Everyone, thank you on behalf of PLEA for coming tonight and braving the weather. My name's Victoria Perman. I was really honoured to be asked to MC tonight. I would like to acknowledge first that the land we meet on is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide Plains, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are as important to the living Kaurna people today, and that this land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are very excited for this first event. I am going to introduce Mark Siventrick, to say a few words about what the PLEA program is and what this oration is about. And I'm going to hand over to Mark. Just so you know, then our special guest, Jay Weatherill, will make his oration, and after that there'll be questions. I'll be roaming with the microphone, so if there are things you would like to ask Jay, please note them down, mental note, and I will come around with the mic afterwards and to take those questions from you. So, Mark, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming along and braving what's obviously a very wet and windy night. I know we've had a few people pull out as a result. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement as well to the traditional owners of the country that we're coming together on tonight, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome here on behalf of the Progressive Labour Education Association, or PLEA as we say it, the PLEA Management Committee. And thank you for coming along tonight to this inaugural Jay Weatherill Progressive Futures Oration. For those of you who don't know, PLEA was established back in 2006. We're a not-for-profit volunteer-based organisation with a focus on providing education, training and workforce work experience programs for people interested in labour movement, unionism and also social justice. And it's fantastic to see tonight a number of people have participated in the program in the past, and also a number of people are participating in the PLEA program this year. One of the questions that I think many people in the room will have asked themselves is, how do I get involved in creating a positive change for the community that I live in? And that's certainly the question we asked ourselves when we looked at what would the focus of the oration be, this annual oration. We didn't really need to look much more past the events that we've all lived through in our community in the past 18 months with COVID. And what we asked ourselves was, how do we make a change? And what does the future look like? So very much forward-looking. So we decided that the oration would focus on a topic or issue that resonated with a contemporary audience. Imagine the impact that had on South Australia in 10 years' time, and explore how the progressive movement could work together really to achieve a more just, inclusive and progressive future for all of the people in South Australia. So that's a little bit of background as to how we've come to talking about a Progressive Futures oration. Furthermore, we thought, who best can we name this event after? And we didn't have to think too much to say a progressive champion in Jay Weatherill. So we're honoured, Jay, that you were happy to lend your name to the oration, but also that you've agreed to be part of this, delivering the lecture for tonight's inaugural address. So I don't want to say anything else. I really just want to say thanks everyone again for braving the weather tonight and coming out. And also, Jay, thanks for coming along and delivering this inaugural lecture.
For those who don't know, there can't be too many, the Honourable Jay Weatherill AO is the CEO of Thrive by 5, responsible for delivering Minderoo's early childhood agenda. Jay was Premier of South Australia for 6.5 years and Minister for 16 years, all up, in various portfolios including early childhood and child protection. He holds law and economics degrees from the University of Adelaide. He's an industry professor at the University of South Australia, an ambassador for Regio Children, is on the governance board for Grade to 8, an early childhood research project, and was recently appointed co-chair of the White Ribbon Australia Advisory Council. Jay was made an officer of the Order of Australia in the 2021 Australia Day Honours lists for his work as Premier and in the early childhood development and tertiary education spaces. He and his wife Mel have 2 daughters, and I'm certain being a father has informed his values in this area. Comrades, Jay Weatherill.
Can you hear me? Yes, excellent. Thank you, Victoria, and I'd also like to acknowledge that we gather today on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. And the first thing I want to do is to thank the Progressive Labor Education Association for this honour. Because I think it's a really good idea to have a forum which is dedicated to the debate and the dissemination of ideas. I think the reform of our democracy is probably one of the most important projects that we face. So anything that encourages debate and discussion about ideas, I think is just a fantastic idea. But it is an honour to have my name stuck on it, although this is traditionally reserved for people that are no longer with us. So that's the other. I'm very grateful to be here in person at this, for obvious reasons. The other thing is I love this space. I haven't lectured in a sunken theatre, and it's a really wonderful space to look up at you all in this way. And I hadn't noticed it from North Terrace before, but it's just such a wonderful place to be. I do intend to launch into a speech. It'll go about 25 minutes. But I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm sure Victoria will lead us through that in a moment. So for governments to be relevant to people's lives, people must believe that they bring value to their lives. Successful governments provide solutions to problems, share some of life's risks, or help shape a broader context in which people can be happy. And this is just pretty basic ideas. Conservative philosophy dictates the best thing governments can do for people is to get out of the way. This scores nicely with the neoliberal orthodoxy of our time, which suggests that small governments, which by nature means reducing burdens on tax revenues and thus taxation, allows people to go about their lives free of interference. Individuals, it's said, can make decisions based on self-interest and ultimately they get what they deserve. This approach to politics, privileging individual self-interest, has been in the ascendance in recent years. But what it's led to are the things that we observe around us: stagnating real wage growth, in relation to the workplace, casualisation and insecure work, in relation to public services, a continuing targeting and narrowing of those services in a way which has meant that we've been unable to grapple with some of the great entrenched social disadvantages. Insecurity is now a defining characteristic of modern Australian life. And the adverse consequences of this approach are many to gnaw around, and they're linked. Mental illness, of which 1 in 5 Australians at any given time suffer, unleashes obviously suffering for the person that experiences it, but also toxic stresses for the environment in which children are brought up, with lifelong negative consequences. There are now more Australian children living in poverty than ever before, more older Australians living their final days isolated and unsupported. Suicide is the leading cause of death in our young children as young as 10 years of age. 1/3 of Aboriginal children will die by taking their own lives. The neoliberal agenda, which once legitimised for its promise of a stronger economy, has produced low growth, unevenly distributed, with rising levels of social dislocation of the type we've just discussed. This is not the picture of a healthy modern society. But during the pandemic, attitudes to the role of government have changed. People's vision of government as a source of security has actually been renewed. People now want and expect governments to step up, to be active and to intervene in their interests. governments can be an expression of unity and security. And where governments have stepped up and played this role, they've been rewarded in the ballot box. I believe that we're now at a point of inflection for Labor. The political environment should suit a party whose instinct it is to accept responsibility and to act assertively in the national interest. But Labor cannot just regurgitate policies and approaches of yesteryear. Times have changed. The pressures that emerge, the objective circumstances are different. Technological advances and disruptions and uncertainties that it's brought now provide the background against which any reform agenda must be measured. So what does a new program for Labor look like? You might recall that together with Craig Emerson back in 2019, we carried out an analysis of the 2019 election. And we posed many questions for Labor in that review. And reflecting on what we found then and what's happened since, and also thinking back now as I've had the opportunity to do over my political career, it seems the things that we identified in that review remain as challenges. The different threads that make Labor's identity, to borrow from Curtin, must be interwoven into a coherent story that resonates with the great mass of the people of Australia. It's always been this way. It's about building coalitions, sometimes amongst different and disparate constituencies, to create a movement for change. Today I want to sketch out one possible vision for Australia and for South Australia, which I believe can achieve these things. But first, a word about what motivates me. I've been a member of this party through my entire adult life. It's a part of me. I watched my father as a union official with what has now become the United Workers' Union travel around representing working people. And what I witnessed is someone who was passionate about advocating on behalf of those who suffer injustice and where there is an abuse of power. And he taught me to respect and listen to working people. This impatience with injustice has stayed with me. I saw my mother, a talented, intelligent and creative woman who lived in an era where talented and creative and intelligent women were not allowed the freedom to realise their full potential. The quest to remove barriers to women realising their dreams remains with me as a central and abiding concern. I'm very privileged at the moment. I have the opportunity in my current role to pursue a policy agenda in a way which is just simply not possible in government. A well-resourced philanthropic foundation which gives me the capacity just to look at one thing and also the resources to pursue that. And ever since I became exposed to the ideas that were brought to South Australia through the thinker in residence, Fraser Mustard, the Canadian neuroscientist, who explained to us about the profound development of a child's brain in the first 5 years of life. And also that other wonderful woman, Carla Rinaldi from the Reggio Emilia School, who came here from northern Italy and showed us a vision of the child and the way in which they learn right from the start. This has been a central and abiding passion for me. But beyond my personal convictions, I firmly believe that the Australian Labor Party would be elected at any election, whether it's the state election or the next federal election, on the basis of a commitment to make sure that Australia is the best place in the world to bring up a child, the best place in the world to be a parent. The electorate would respond to a platform that reduces pressures on families and put children at the centre of our national project. Such a platform would not only bring economic security to families, it would also mean that we would raise a new generation with greater capacities, a greater capacity to participate in both the economic and social life of our nation. I firmly believe that family policy, and specifically reform of our early childhood development system, is the economic and social agenda that our nation is looking for. I believe that we could craft a policy agenda that takes pressure off families, addresses one of the great sources of widespread inequality, namely gender inequality, offers us a direct means of addressing our continuing national disgrace, Aboriginal disadvantage, but also raising the general level of capacity of our citizens so that we can lift national productivity and therefore national prosperity. One policy agenda could break the false dichotomy between social and economic policy, build a bridge between Labor's disparate constituencies, and unite and powerfully activate women as a source of not only campaign capacity for this agenda, but also electoral support. And all this, in my view, could be as meaningful for suburban Australia as it is for people living in the bush. As meaningful to a chief executive officer of a corporation or a hospitality worker, and as important to a pregnant mum as it is to a tradie husband. It's the capacity to, this is an agenda that's got the capacity to work across all of these constituencies and unite them. But I first want to, before I go into more detail about that, I just want to pause to think about what has been the political context into which we've been formulating our policies as a Labor Party over recent decades. For over a quarter of a century, we, the left, have been looking for a coherent economic narrative which provides us with a vision which ensures that it addresses our concerns about equality, empathy, vibrancy and diversity. We've been searching for a policy of that sort. During that whole period, two forces have been at play. The anxiety and insecurity of the individual caused by dislocations of whole industries and the loss of jobs that families and communities rely upon for their economic security and social connections has accelerated. We're seeing massive change in our suburbs as jobs that were seen as secure and certain have been just swept away by essentially technological change, but fueled through essentially the interconnectedness of the world that we now live in. And so that's the first thing, this notion of anxiety that's been caused by massive change and disruption. The second great tendency has been the ascendancy of neoliberalism, the notion that the market can solve all of our problems and that intervention is either pointless or actually makes matters worse. So those two ideas, I believe, have framed up what's been happening in politics over recent decades. And in the face of this rising insecurity and anxiety, we have not done enough to challenge the economic orthodoxy of our generation. As Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis described, economics has become the new secular religion, replacing science as the new divine order. We've started describing public policy in exclusively economic terms. As the late British American historian Tony Judd lamented, we've stopped arguing for policies because we believe that they are right, rather than appealing to the God of the economy. The more we use the language of economics to argue for human-centred public policy, the more our electoral proposition appeared limited to a better version of the same product. So there's no differentiation between us and our Conservative opponents. It also did something very profound and damaging for progressive parties. That is that it fed into a deep distrust of politics and politicians. And progressive parties can't survive in that environment. Because we all sounded the same, it fed into the idea that we were complicit with the very forces that were causing this dislocation. And so they wouldn't trust us either. This also fueled the rise of populist parties of the left and the right, who were giving voice to those anxieties. They were channeling the pain and the suffering and the anxieties that exist. They may not have had a coherent program, but at least they are empathetic with the concerns of ordinary, everyday Australians. So the demand for public services, mental health, aged care, childcare, public housing have all increased dramatically as this insecurity is accelerated. But we remain committed to the thinking that left Australians feeling as though they had to fend for themselves. So people didn't feel like they were being looked after in this time of crisis. Australia urgently needs to repair the social damage caused by the dislocations to families and communities by this technological change and the consequences of globalisation and challenge this ascendant ideology which constrains our willingness to respond. And it's interesting that the pandemic has almost shown us the way through that. Pandemic has made governments relevant. The pandemic has demonstrated that with assertive government actions, governments can meet the needs of citizens. And of course, citizens have been grateful, and confidence in politics and politicians has correspondingly increased. What I contend is that early learning reform is the seed from which we might grow a response to the dilemma that I outlined earlier. So you remember the review talked about this dilemma for Labor. How does it create a constituency which is broad enough and strong enough to actually capture the majority of Australians and their imagination, but is challenged by these disparate constituencies, a dislocated blue-collar working class and a cosmopolitan elite, and the bringing together, bridging this gap has been one of the great challenges. So, early learning. Our understanding of the importance of the early years is relatively new, only around about 30 odd years. Before then, we used to think that children developed on a pretty much a chronological basis, that their brains developed, they were fed, they were nurtured and looked after, they'd hit developmental milestones. Now we know that children are born with all of the brain cells they will ever have, and what happens is they will all gradually be winnowed away unless they're actually turned on through connections. So, and those connections occur through essentially experiences, which switch on these multiple sensing pathways, and as they all connect, that builds capability, that builds well-being, that builds essentially learning and development. And this miraculous period where there's 1 million neural connections occurring every second through high-quality interactions between children and their parents or caregivers, or in high-quality early learning settings, is the foundation for all later human development. Indeed, the trajectory of health, well-being, learning, behaviour is fundamentally established in those first 5 years. It's the most amazing period. Of course, correspondingly, a child that's born into toxic stress environment, none of those connections are made. And so this period is just such a profound period. The systems and policies that exist, though, and have emerged, have also been influenced by neoliberalism over this same period. So as our understanding of the way in which a child's developed, that's actually neatly corresponded with this period when we've been retreating from the role of government in supporting families, in creating the very environment where this change might occur. The modern childcare system was conceived as a childminding service where subsidies replaced direct government funding. At the time, the system was designed with the central goal of getting parents back to work. Learning opportunities for children were only a secondary consideration. So childcare became part of our market society through admittedly a mixed market, which also includes not-for-profit and community-run centres, but about half the sector is for-profit. Educators were commodified and made to work in insecure and poorly remunerated arrangements. This is true of all workers in the care economy, in which salaries reflect the market rather than the social value of the work that they do. So the market does not value their work highly, but the social value of providing early learning and care to our children is incredibly high. Too many highly profitable centres don't meet national quality standards. There is a 30% turnover amongst childcare workers, which disrupts one of the most profoundly important elements of quality, which is the relationship between the educators and the children. Early learning in Australia is unaffordable to many families and is of inadequate quality for many Australian children. And that affordability pressure creates its own negative influence on the environment in which children are brought up. The current system does not reflect the importance of the early learning system to a child's health, learning and behavioural trajectories. And when you understand the brain story, the underlying deficiencies in our early learning system becomes even more unacceptable. And this is before you even consider the universal high-quality early learning system and its contribution to our prosperity, our national prosperity. Quarantined from any market institutionalisation and decommodified, early learning would ironically make a far greater contribution to economic growth. Growth, as you know, is influenced by three principal factors: productivity, participation and population. All of these factors are influenced by high quality early learning. Productivity, in terms of just the general level of capability of our citizens, the way in which they develop. We know that the executive functions, which are such an important part of modern economic life, the ability to organise thoughts, the ability to control moods, the ability to negotiate arrangements with other people, those critical executive functions, important building blocks are laid down in the first 5 years of life. They are the jobs, ironically, that the jobs that are actually surviving. The process jobs are disappearing. It's the jobs that require those functions that are the jobs of the future. They're the very functions that are actually being developed in the first 5 years of life. We also know that in terms of productivity, Australia has one of the highest, it does in fact has number one, the highest level of female educational attainment in the world. An extraordinary achievement. We've got best educated women in the world, but we've also got one of the highest rates of part-time employment in the world, because we have a system which essentially penalises women who want to do more than part-time work. That loss of productivity, where women who want to work are unable to participate in the workforce because of our arrangements, essentially punishes our national prosperity. And of course also the life ambitions of those women, their ability, it's the single most important reason why women actually are behind in terms of the pay equity gap. And that then translates into lifelong earnings and including superannuation. We also know that a critical factor in growth is population. Fertility rates in Australia fell to the lowest level on record in 2019. And Australia's declining fertility has in the past been offset by high migration levels, which are under real challenge in relation to the current arrangements. But why are families deciding that the marginal decisions about whether families have additional children is going to be fundamentally affected by the level of support society provides to families with children? This is not a family-friendly society. It is tough to have kids, and there is the level of support which is provided to people that choose to have children is simply not there. Other developed nations in the world have moved strongly in this space. There is a reason why Japan in 2019, Canada and the United States just this year have all announced substantial reforms and additional investments to preschool and childcare universal and of high standard. If Australia is to ignore this important area of public policy, we're going to continue to see our national capacity to participate in world affairs fall further behind. So this, I believe, would contribute make an important contribution to Australia's economic growth. And what we've seen in recent times is that the constraints on economic growth are not the sorts of barriers that were swept away in the 1980s reforms, like deregulation of the financial market, or sweeping aside tariff reforms, or changes to the industrial relations system. They're actually things which might otherwise have been described as areas of social policy. Inequality is a brake on economic growth. The way in which the world of work interacts with family life is a brake on economic growth. So this is what 21st century economic policy looks like. Not big policy calls at the commanding heights of the economy, but the really complex work of looking at what are the needs of families in their relation to their economic life, but also how that marries with their social life, with their family life. And it is complex because it involves us having to negotiate this very complex interaction between various levels of government. There's none of these service systems that exist in one state government agency or one federal government agency. So you've got different levels of government, different agencies of government, and indeed the complex interaction between what is seen as a domestic or private sphere, that is parenting. So this is complex public policy issue, but the prize is enormous. The prize is enormous for getting it right. What it can unlock in terms of national prosperity is extraordinary. And there is, I believe, a possibility of using this particular issue as a way of knitting together quite diverse constituencies. Family policy is not the wholly owned province of conservative parties. It shouldn't be, and it doesn't need to be, and there is an opportunity for it to be grasped by the Labor Party. Economics actually has an interesting etymology. It comes from two Greek words, echo meaning home and nomos meaning accounts. So it's actually home economics. Initially, economics was about family accounts. And in ancient Greece, as today, economics was a study of the relationship between ends and means. But whereas contemporary economics is largely neutral as between ends, in ancient economic theory, an action is considered economically rational only when it contributed to a praiseworthy end. There's much merit in this way of thinking. After all, what is the economy designed to serve? Not itself. It's there for society. Who else could it possibly be serving? For Labor, an economic reform agenda must also respond to this second criteria. Will it result in praiseworthy social ends? In other words, what society will we encourage through this economic policy? So it's important that we promote an economic agenda designed to achieve praiseworthy social ends. An early learning system is one of those socially consequential and progressive social ends. We have a critical role to describe the purpose of public policy and how it contributes to praiseworthy ends. These broad objectives, the question of wealth, opportunity, well-being, solidarity, justice, emancipation, security, these ends resonate with ordinary everyday Australians. And we must talk about them in a way which makes all Australians feel the Labor Party is relevant to them. If we fix an objective on making Australia the greatest place in the world to grow up, the greatest place in the world to be a parent, our narrative will speak to the majority of Australians. Universal access to high quality early learning will bring greater choice and economic security to many Australian families. Or in the words of Curtin, bringing something better to people, better standards of living, greater happiness to the mass of people. But a universal policy framework will appeal, obviously, to the broad cross-section of the Australian community, but it will also ensure that it meets all of the needs of the various constituencies with whom we seek to knit together. It would serve the interests of working people. A universal high-quality place-based early learning system would not be able to be achieved without just wage and secure working conditions. And the unions, the representatives of the early educators, the United Workers Union, the school-based preschool, the Australian Education Union, and the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation, who represent nurses, and of course the unions that represent the various educators and trainers of all of that workforce. All of those organisations would have an interest, and their members have an interest in an outcome which delivers a high quality early learning system which values their work. It would also provide an opportunity for gender equality. It would be emancipatory, giving greater choice to more women and remove important lifetime barriers to economic security and professional advancement. An early learning reform would also drive equality. Currently, 21.7% of Australian children enter school developmentally vulnerable. Although not entirely deterministic, those trajectories are established very early and prove incredibly difficult to shift. While redistributive measures remain an important instrument to achieve actual equality, the extent of the intervention that we'd need to make would be dramatically reduced if we could shift resources into the early years. It costs 10 times as much to remedy the disadvantages that occur later in life than if they're actually tackled in the first 5 years. A world-leading universal system of early learning is an enlightened form of social justice. There are some jurisdictions that are moving. In Victoria, where 3 and 4-year-old preschool is beginning to become universal, participation of children known to child protection in the Early Start Kindergarten program has increased from around 20% to 42% over the last 6 years. This is significant because evidence shows that by 3, students attached to preschool are 15 to 20 weeks ahead of those who did not, and by the age of 16, students who attended 2 years of preschool have significantly higher educational outcomes. And this is relevant to the life opportunities of every single one of those children. So the best way of addressing problems is at their source, positively influencing lifelong trajectories. And it's my firm belief that early learning offers our best hope for Aboriginal people. We'll not close the gap without it. Catherine Little from SNAIC, the National Non-Government Peak Body for Australia, represent the interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the early learning sector, said during Reconciliation Week, for Australians to truly embrace reconciliation, we need to stop and look around us and ask, how can we better support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families? In Victoria, once again, Koori Kids Shine, a kindergarten campaign, has resulted in sustained increases in participation of 3 and 4-year-old Aboriginal children. Our vision for early learning must emphasise the importance of place, which brings autonomy and pride through developing distinct community-led early learning opportunities within a broad, universal and framework. So early learning is a consequential social and economic reform. It will mean more Australians will be better supported to focus on the most important job they'll ever have in their life, which is bringing up their children. And for those who deride this policy as being too heavily influenced by social issues, I repeat again, this is what 21st century economic policy looks like. We need, rather than cast our mind back to look for what it is that the big policy agenda that somehow we were proud to observe in previous generations, whether it was Whitlam Suring, the western suburbs of Sydney, whether it was Hawke Keating opening up our economy to the world. Those were the objective circumstances that faced them in their eras. No point in harking back to those. What we need to do is to look at what are the challenges that are facing our community at this point in our history, having regard to the pressures on our communities, and come up with a bold program of reform. The economic imperatives of today involve the reordering of the work-life balance, because it has got out of kilter. There are too many people that are feeling under too much pressure, and you only need to look at the stats about mental health. I mean, how can it be acceptable that the leading cause of death of our young children is suicide? How can this be right? This is not a healthy society. So the complexity of executing on this agenda, as I said before, can't be underestimated. But you first need to start with a vision. And the vision of a pram's walk away in every neighbourhood, a place where you can go to actually meet other parents, expectant mothers, fathers, parents that already have young children, ideally attached to a school site where you can have your needs met, your children's needs met, and where you can be part of a community. That social support that is so essential to allow us all to get through our daily lives. When things get hard, there is somebody to talk to. And for those parents that have not had the benefit of good parenting, to witness good parenting, to see what it looks like, and to have trained educators there that can be the bridge between that neuroscience and the parenting practice. This is a vision that Australians will buy into. And in my belief, it is a huge agenda, but the prize is also huge. An adequately funded, world-class early learning system could be a foundation of a healthy society. The chronic diseases which are plaguing us and which are causing enormous difficulties for our emergency departments as we speak are the very conditions that are laid down in the first 5 years of life. These diabetes, chronic heart disease, all of these conditions, the precursors for which are laid down in the first 5 years. So if we want a long-term vision for a healthy society, it has to start in the first 5 years. So the choice is stark. If we continue to permit the gap to remain between what we know about how children's brains develop and what we do as a society, we're going to resign ourselves to children being denied the opportunity to develop and be the very best they can be. Australian families will continue to struggle with economic insecurity. Australian women will continue to face unnecessary barriers which prevent them from realising their full potential. And Australia as a nation will struggle to compete with those who have invested more heavily in their children. Or we could have this future: Australian children flourishing, Australian families thriving, Australian women realising their full potential, the Australian nation prospering. Early learning illuminates the progressive project in the 21st century. It's human-centred, it's forward-looking, and it's exactly what economic reform should be all about. And it's an opportunity for our party to grasp. Thank you.
If we were in the United States, I could say thank you, Premier, because they never lose their title when they leave office, do they? Thank you, Jay. I'm going to roam for questions. I'm coming to you up there.
very much. Alice Dawkins, UCLA. You alluded to these changing functions of work, and you began this framing that I think some of us agree is a little out of date, which is the blue-collar, white-collar framework. And I heard a reference to the caring economy, and I just wanted to drill into what new functional categories of work we can think through as both a public policy agenda and a campaigning agenda. And I was writing down sort of care work, knowledge work, and services work as starting categories. Does that kind of taxonomy make sense to you for 21st century campaigning?
Absolutely. I suppose I was using a bit of a shorthand to describe, the cultural sort of distinction between what has become a group of people who have become arguably alienated from labour in a way which seems a bit inexplicable, given that they are workers and they manifestly their economic interests would reside in a party which had traditionally supported and protected those workers. But increasingly we're seeing many of them essentially flee from Labor in the last election. So this is very much a dichotomy that we explored in the review, as opposed to another group of workers who. So what one needs to go back, I think, to this notion of identity, to actually, if you identify yourself by your connection to the means of production, which is the traditional labour model, then that remains relevant to you. This notion of the language of working class, of blue collar, trade union, high level affiliation to trade unions. That's a group which was back in 1920 was 80% of the workforce. So it made a whole lot of sense for Labor in 1920 to be just a party of blue-collar workers and to have a whole bunch of unions affiliated to the party, and that therefore that established its mass base and identity. Now we've flipped that around. I think it's more like 2080, blue-collar, industrial versus a whole range of other different ways of describing that arrangement, the relationship to work. And there's a lot of working people that don't necessarily identify themselves by their relationship to their workplace. It's not a key element of their identity. In fact, they're more likely to identify themselves by their relationship to their consumption. I'm a surfer, I'm a, whatever it else is that's the most interesting part of their life. So if we have a heavily labourist sort of class-based analysis, you can see how that's going to have a shrinking appeal. And of course, Labor has added a whole bunch of other constituencies. It's added environmentalists, feminists, gay and lesbian rights communities, and so it's sought to build a broader constituency to actually, take on Aboriginal, disadvantage in particular social demographies. It's broadened out its appeal. But holding that all together is actually quite a complex task. So when I use those categories, I don't use them I think they are inadequate. I agree they are completely inadequate. And in a sense, that's actually the problem, the inadequacies of those categories. And I think the whole point of what I'm trying to say is let's choose an agenda which actually crosses all those boundaries and speaks to people and meets their needs in ways which doesn't rely upon old categories of identity, if you like. It seeks to transcend those various issue-based identities into something which is more profound, and it's about family life in a way where we can unite a very broad group of people. I wouldn't get too hung up about the categories that I use. I'm really using them to say that they're not a good idea.
Next question.
Whenever Labor's trying to reform, the Liberals mount a big scare campaign and undermine, every piece of the policy that sort of proposed. What do you
Well, they say that they haven't got a good argument about the fact that the system is broken, and that you'll never hear them advance that. What they say is that it's too expensive. So that's the argument. It's too expensive, and they'll try and rerun, because they had such a good time of it at the last election, this idea that Labor's a big tax and spend operation. It's going to collapse the economy, and you'll lose your job, and they'll feed in. They'll build on the insecurity that people feel about life already, and say this risky alternative is going to make life more risky. So we've spent a lot of time in the campaign thinking about that. And so you would have seen that we've actually tried to mobilise a lot of Conservative voices, like John Hewson, of all people, who's come out and said, look, this reform would pay for itself. And it's interesting, we track polling on this agenda, and there's been about an 18% movement in people thinking that reform of the early learning system would be good for the economy amongst Conservative voters. So you can win an argument. I mean, I think the good thing about this agenda is that there's a progressive and a Conservative sort of frame for this. The Conservative frame is supports family life, we're all for the family, adds to national productivity through allowing more high productivity women access to the economy, avoids the cost of late intervention, because there's a really big bill that we're already paying to spend remedying what goes wrong in the first 5 years. So Conservative tropes. And then on the progressive side, remedying disadvantage, building out the social insurance project. We've got public education now, we need to move back in the first 5 years. And, the women's thing probably crosses over. The women is sort of like Conservative women, progressive women. So there's been in fact, that's actually been if there's been a driving force behind the campaign, it's been the women's voice. Because you might have seen the last budget, they went some way to try and respond to this issue. And it's because they were being painted as being anti-women, and they had to actually respond to that agenda. So I think they'll still try and say it's too expensive, but there are some pretty powerful arguments to show that this actually pays for itself.
So federal recently announced a policy of universal childcare. Do you think this goes towards the way of accomplishing a early childhood learning scenario, or do you think it's building on a flawed system?
Look, it's pretty good, and it's much better than what's on offer from the Conservatives, but it doesn't go far enough. So it concentrates on child care alone, and doesn't look at broadening out sort of an early childhood development agenda. The shorthand we use for that is early learning. So if you think about it, there are about 5 service systems that are involved in the first 5 years. There's infant and maternal health, there's child care, which is the federal sort of thing, there's preschool, there's child protection, and then there's generally sort of community and family services, general support for families. And so the problem, while it is a good thing what Labor has done, it's probably a necessary first step, because you've got this market model at the moment, every time you actually increase the subsidy, it also has the perverse effect of the fees just keep going up. So there is a sort of a challenge with how the system is actually constructed. So the whole model needs to be reformed. So I would say it's a good step. The next step, I think, is if you want to build this system out in chunks, because it probably can't be built out overnight, you do what Labor's trying to do in relation to the subsidy. You'd probably introduce 3-year-old preschool. You'd also have a universal nurse home visiting system, and you'd put the whole agenda on the National Cabinet agenda to try and work out the complexities of the relationship between the Commonwealth and the states. So it's sort of like this makes NDIS, which is really, we're still building out, look easy. And that was hard. So, it's a big, bold difficult agenda. But in a way, that's sort of like, that's why you keep electing governments to do important things. And it's the reason why you have to keep re-electing them. So you remember when Hawke and Keating during the 80s, people were getting sick of them during the 80s, but they still said, oh, we've got to keep voting for them because they're not finished. Like they have to, they're still rebuilding this economy. And we need a project which is more than just we're going to do this in the next 3 years. We're actually going to build out a system that gives us a purpose, a direction, and a big one.
Thank you for your speech tonight, Jay. One of the things that I learned about when I learned about did family dispute resolution training was a lot about child trauma, and there was a real focus on attachment theory.
Yeah.
And obviously that's really important in the first year of life. So I wondered if, and that obviously goes a long way towards development as well. So I wondered if a policy like this would go hand in hand also with policy for a long period, maybe up to a year of parental leave.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I didn't get into it because it's sort of part of the detailed policy design of a system like this. But obviously the first 6 months, 12 months, it's profoundly about the connection that occurs between the primary caregiver and the child. And that's so central to everything that flows. Of course, that's unevenly shared at the moment between, the parenting role is unevenly shared between men and women. And so there's a massive opportunity for us to increase the quality and the length of the childcare. I think it's 18 weeks at the moment. It could go to, it ideally could be extended well beyond that, but also an incentive for men to be involved in those early years. But this, when you actually then start to delve into the detail of this, it starts to surface the complexity. So because now you're talking about male and female role in parenting, you're also talking about the relationship between the workplace and the way in which work needs to be reconfigured to actually allow people to not completely sacrifice their careers or have to make a choice between career and bringing up children. So this, just gives you some idea about how complex this is, and also how fraught it is, because there's also a lot of choice that comes in. I mean, there's nothing wrong with somebody if they could, of course, do this, but it's unusual. But if you just spend 5 years meeting all the developmental needs of your own children, well, that would be wonderful. But there's not many people that can or either equipped or financially secure enough to do that. And there's also something important about centre-based learning and the skills and capabilities of those early educators. I mean, they're incredibly talented, and they've got a massive thing to offer. It's not to say a parent couldn't do that, but it's highly unlikely, and they would also lose the social, the social connections, the reciprocity that occurs between other children and other adults in the lives of those children. So negotiating all of those complexities is really is part of the task of the reform.
Thank you. You mentioned in your speech, or at least briefly mentioned, the full in support for establishment parties due to great disillusionment with their base, and how this has allowed populism to flourish, both rising to concerns of both the left and the right. Now, with this era of populism which we're seeing, and also the great distrust in politics, how do you think it's given the position that Labor is in now for 60 federally? How do you think we best rekindle the trust of people who have turned their backs on us and think that we are the same as the Liberals?
Look, I think populism just emerges into vacuums. It moves in when there's a gap, a space for it. If you're able to actually come up with credible, responsive policy agendas that actually meet the interests of citizens, and you can start building coalitions, there's no room for the populist to move. Where the populist thrives is in circumstances where people can see all these awful things happening in their lives. They can see their lives becoming harder, more difficult. And then they hear a politician say, well, we can't do anything about, what you've got to understand is that, they're international forces and, and then they reach two conclusions. Either you're incompetent or you're on the take. Because why aren't you responding to our needs? We're suffering and you're not meeting our needs. So there are, and then of course Pauline Hanson just says, shouts and screams and emotes, but that looks closer to how you're feeling. She's angry, I'm angry, she's angry, she sounds like she's got it. These other guys are making excuses for the system. So I think all roads lead back to high quality public policy. You get that right, you don't have to worry about the populists. There's no room for them. They get squeezed out. And interesting, I think these COVID elections that have occurred, because what's happened with COVID? Massive threat. And then government steps up and largely in this country does a pretty good job. And everybody goes, wow, government's relevant, they're acting in my interests, they're protecting my life and limb, and, I'm going to reward that at the ballot box. And then, the other parties tend to get squeezed out of that equation. So I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't worry about them. I don't think there's I don't think populism is. See, I think Trump is like. Basically, you had Democrats and Republicans where there's consensus that globalisation, technological change, fantastic. There was a consensus there. What Trump did is just scooped up all the disaffected from both parties and took over the Republicans. But he could easily have been, on the left of politics, because it was the disaffected people were probably former Democrats that have been left behind by the system. So I think that's our issue, is when we don't meet the needs of the citizens.
We have one last question. Oh, you want to yell?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Can we just, these are the current PLEA participants. Can
Ah.
you put your hands up? Current PLEA participants. Thank you. And past?
Oh.
And future? Ashton, maybe? Your question, Lee.
I just had a question surrounding, we've talked a lot, or you've spoken a lot.
You might have to use the microphone because my
sorry.
hearing is not.
Sorry, you've spoken a lot to the importance of early childhood education, and I definitely agree that's something that we need to work on. But in terms of, at the end of the day, those children still go home to a family with parents or a household or major influences who maybe haven't received that same education, and they will be largely influenced by them. So how do you propose that we work to educate those people that will be bringing them up, especially for children that are in single parent or low socioeconomic households?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we could spend another whole lecture on what a great early childhood development system looks like. But here in South Australia, we made a bit of a start on this, courtesy of Fraser Mustard. He recommended that we establish what he called children's centres, but the long name for them was Children's Centres for Early Childhood Development and Parenting. And that's the critical bit, and parenting. Because these are places where people can be empowered with knowledge to actually know, how to interact with children, but also with support to, because it's fine to say, here's how to bring up a child, but if there are all these other pressures on your life, then your ability to actually meet the needs of somebody else in your life are going to become correspondingly more difficult. So it's as much about parenting. It's not just a place to go to fix your child up. It's basically a community resource that actually supports you in the. So it's not just what happens in the centre. It's what happens in home, what you learn in the centre, the support you get in the centre, and the complex interaction between the public spaces and the private spaces. I mean, this whole system is about reciprocity, about the connection that exists between you and your child, between the child and other children. And what's actually happening here is that I mean, when a child is born, a parent is born, and they learn together. I mean, you're learning as much from your child as they're learning from you. I mean, this is but at the moment, it's just made, that space is not created for what should be the most important and magnificent period, you know, of existence. We don't do that. We don't value it. We make it hard for people, and that's what we're really proposing.
So I'm one of the PLEA participants, and there's now a question that I'd ask every single speaker that comes to a PLEA event or any of the sessions or these events, and that question is, who is your favourite Pokemon?
Well, I think, is there a little yellow one? Is it Pikachu? Okay.
Pikachu, the common one. Yeah, or the one everyone knows.
The yellow one, is your answer? The yellow one?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Round of applause.
Ducking way behind that.
I didn't see what you were doing.
That is one of the best end of lecture questions I think I've heard. The yellow one was a great response. I was sitting there thinking, which one would I go for? And Jane, just on behalf of everyone here, on behalf of the PLEA committee as well, I want to say thank you so much for delivering this inaugural lecture. I think there couldn't be a more apt topic to discuss than early childhood. Highly relevant to looking at progressive futures. And I think importantly what came out to me as we were listening was how it really is an opportunity, as a rallying cry for many of us to get behind, and it's something that connects not just with people in this room, but people right across the community. So thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to give you a bottle of wine and some chocolates to take out with you.
And while you're clapping, please, another round of applause for Mark and Gabby and everyone else on the PLEA committee.